Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Friday, May the 10th, 2024. This week we've been looking at 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter of the Bible, of the New Testament especially, and talking about the whole concept of love in terms of how the Bible defines and uses that word. You know, what is love? We talked about the different kinds of love that the Greeks even distinguished with different words. And it's all of those things, of course, but more. And it's precisely because there's so many different understandings and definitions of the word love that we have to be very careful, also very specific when considering this reading. Here I'm, for the rest of the way and also tomorrow, going to kind of paraphrase or edit kind of the highlights of my sermon last week, because it dawned on me as I started doing these that normally people would have watched the service online if they weren't here in person. And of course, we didn't have the online or the streaming capacity. So for those of you who were in church on Sunday, this will be somewhat repetitive, but for those of you who were not, this gives you a sense of what I was talking about. Of course, 1 Corinthians 13 is where we usually hear it at weddings. I'm even reminded of the movie The Wedding Crashers, where Owen Wilson and Vince Vaughn play these best friends who purposely crash wedding receptions in order to partake of all the food and alcohol, and needless to say, also to pick up women. And in fact, in one of the early scenes, the two of them are at a wedding ceremony when the pastor announces that the bride's sister is now going to read some scripture. And Owen leans over and whispers to Vince, $20, it's 1 Corinthians 13. To which Vince replies, double or nothing, Colossians 3:12. Well, the bride's sister then takes the podium and begins an hour reading from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Now, if I was a betting man, my own money would have been on Owen Wilson for sure, and perhaps yours as well, because 1 Corinthians 13 is easily one of the best known, most recognizable passages in the Bible, precisely because of its frequent use at weddings. As Michael Boss has noted, it represents one of the most beautiful expressions of love found in the entire Bible. But here's the thing, despite its frequent use at weddings, 1 Corinthians 13 is really not about marriage and romantic love at all. Rather, despite its frequent use at weddings, 1 Corinthians 13 is really about the kind of love that fellow Christians are to have for each other in the church, believe it or not, especially when their life together in the church is difficult and challenging, as is so often. Specifically, as we heard just the other week, the church in Corinth that Paul was writing to was split apart by divisions, disruptions, dissensions. And right away in that very first chapter then of 1 Corinthians, Paul begins talking about some of these divisions that existed at that time in the Corinthian church. Again, as we heard, apparently there were factions, he says, divided along their loyalties to certain leaders, including Cephas, otherwise known to us as Peter, also Apollos, that eloquent preacher from Alexandria, and even Paul himself. However, if you read further in the letter, there were also theological disputes and moral and ethical disorders as well that Paul needed to address. All in all, the church in Corinth, as talented as it was, and it was talented, make no mistake about it, was also kind of a mess at the same time, overconfident, full of pride, among other things. And at one point, in fact, Paul praised them for the variety of spiritual gifts they possessed. But now, in this reading, 1 Corinthians 13, he reminds them that even if they have every spiritual gift, even if they have all knowledge, even if they have tremendous faith, if they don't also have love, then it doesn't really count. They don't amount to anything at all if love does not undergird and inform everything else. But that brings us right back to where we started, doesn't it? In other words, what is love? At least the kind of love that Paul is talking about. As I think I mentioned yesterday, the Greek word that Paul uses here in 1 Corinthians 13, that the rest of the New Testament writers overwhelmingly used as well, is the word agape. Someone wants to find agape love as an unconditional commitment to actively pursue and secure the good of another through sacrificial behavior. And that's kind of a mouthful, I know, but in short, it's a love not based on feelings or emotions or on beauty, even the lovability of the one being loved, but rather it's an intentional love, a committed love, a sacrificial love, a love that always seeks the best for others and not merely the self. Now, this word for love, agape, appears approximately 259 times in the New Testament, but here's the thing. It appears 143 of those times, or a little more than half the time, as a verb. In other words, love, biblical love, is an action word. It implies doing something that is loving as opposed to merely feeling something. Even more, it's meant to be given away. In the summer of 1960, the great musical star Mary Martin was on Broadway playing the lead role of Maria von Trapp in the Rodgers and Hammerstein classic musical The Sound of Music. Lyricist Oscar Hammerstein, however, was on his deathbed at the time. And so one evening just before Mary went out on stage, a note was handed to her, and it was from Oscar Hammerstein. And it read, "Dear Mary, a bell is not a bell until you ring it. A song is not a song until you sing it. Love in your heart is not put there to stay. Love isn't love till you give it away." After her performance that evening, a number of people, including fellow cast members, rushed backstage exclaiming, "Mary, what happened to you out there tonight? We've never heard anything quite like it. You sang with more feeling and more power, more emotion than ever before." And blinking back the tears, Mary read them Hammerstein's note. And then she simply said, "Tonight, I gave my love away." Or as New Testament scholar Brian Peterson has written here, love is a busy, active thing that never ceases to work. It is always finding ways to express itself for the good of others. The point is not a flowery description of what love is in some abstract and theoretical sense, but of what love does, and especially what love does to one's brother or sister in the church. But it's not always easy to love others, is it? Years ago, there was a Peanuts cartoon in which Linus announced to his sister Lucy that he was going to become a doctor. "You, a doctor?" she replied doubtfully. "How can you be a doctor? You don't love mankind." And Linus replied, "I do too love mankind. It's people I can't stand." Dr. Ken Keith is an inspiring speaker and author, and back in 1968, when he was just 19 years old and a sophomore at Harvard University, he wrote something called the Paradoxical Commandments. And subsequently, they spread all over the world, have now been read and used by virtually millions of people. In fact, even Mother Teresa put them up on a wall in her children's home in Calcutta, leading to the mistaken notion that after her death that she, not Dr. Keith, was actually their author. It's the very first of these paradoxical commandments that applies here. People are illogical, unreasonable, and self-centered, he wrote. Then he added, love them anyway. Well, that's exactly what Paul is saying here in 1 Corinthians 13 as well. But just as it's helpful to distinguish between the agape love that Paul is referring to and all the other kinds of love and uses of the word love that we so often encounter, it's also important, I think, for us to look at how Paul describes this Christian love. That is, what this love we should have for each other in the church looks like in practical terms. And so we'll do that tomorrow. I'll pick that up, that train of thought tomorrow in our fifth and final day of daily devotions this week. Till then, take care. Have a great day today. Bye.